Every parent knows that moment of hesitation, that split second when a child pleads to walk home alone, play in the front yard, or ride their bike around the block. In August 2000, on the quiet streets of Vallejo, California, an innocent decision would trigger a chain of events that forced every parent in America to ask themselves, how confident are you about your neighborhood's safety? How sure are you that a serial predator isn't lurking around the corner, watching your children? For one family, these weren't just hypothetical questions. They were about to become their reality. The loving parents had 3 children, the youngest of whom was 8-year-old Midsi Sanchez. Mitzi was born on August 12, 1992, and had always been active, positive, brave, and determined. Her 8th birthday was a significant event for her, and she was eagerly getting ready for school that morning, already imagining how she would return after classes and how the real celebration would begin. At the end of the school day on August 12, 2000, Mitzi was so excited that she decided not to wait for her older brothers, with whom she usually walked home, and leave on her own. Walking home seemed like a simple task to her, as the school was just a few blocks away from the Sanchez's house, and she knew the route well. Mitzi left school around 4 p.m., wanting to get ahead of her 2 older brothers, and immediately headed home with confidence, imagining that soon she would be opening presents and seeing her birthday cake. At this time, her family had almost finished preparing for the celebration and were waiting for the children, all believing it would be a bright, festive event, not suspecting the unpleasant turn of fate that awaited Mitzi. Mitzi had walked about halfway to her house and was on the last stretch of the street when she noticed a stranger staring at her intently from a car parked beside the road. Later, Mitzi would remember how the man gave her a cold look that made her feel uneasy. Still, she didn't give it much importance and continued walking home. Just in case, Mitzi decided to cross to the other side of the road, away from the suspicious car, even though her house was on the side where she had been walking. Instinctively, she decided to avoid this suspicious person who was watching her almost constantly. When Mitzi crossed over and the man realized she was going to leave, he got out of the car and called her over. The man pointed to his side mirror, which was loose, and said he wanted to secure it, but had a problem. He explained that he had injured his leg when he fell off his bicycle and couldn't bend enough to reach the tape lying between the seats in his car. The man realistically acted as if he couldn't do this because of his injury. The stranger smiled cordially and even took several steps, limping heavily and holding onto the car to be more convincing. He managed to persuade Mitzi that he needed help. He succeeded in deceiving her. Mitzi felt sorry for the man and responded to help. They approached the car together on the passenger side as the driver's door was closed. At this time, the man pointed Mitzi to the space between the seats. But as soon as she leaned down to try to feel for the object, he shoved her inside and locked the door. When Mitzi found herself inside, she started screaming and immediately tried to open the doors, but they were all blocked. The perpetrator had clearly prepared for this turn of events. The man magically stopped limping, quickly jumped to the driver's side, got into the car, and sped away from that spot. The criminal had perfectly timed the moment when no one would see the abduction, neither motorists nor pedestrians. That section of the street was empty during these hours. During the same period, Mitzi's brothers left school as their classes had also ended. The boys didn't find their sister waiting for them. They were told that she had already left, so they headed home along exactly the same route. The boys assumed Mitzi had rushed home to start the celebration as soon as possible. The teenagers hurried after her so they wouldn't be late too. They were shocked when their sister wasn't at home with everyone else. Everyone was waiting for her and started to worry. When the brothers arrived without Mitzi, they suspected something was wrong. Family members began to wonder where Mitzi could have disappeared to and what had happened to the birthday girl. Meanwhile, Mitzi was inside the vehicle with the perpetrator. She was in the back seat, crying and screaming, begging the man to stop and let her go. But he simply ignored her tears. Instead, the man used a lock and chain to restrain his captive inside the car. The stranger drove to the parking lot of a remote shopping center. There were no other cars here, not even people passing by. He drove into a dead end where he couldn't be seen, then handed Mitzi a paper bag with clothes and demanded she change. Mitzi didn't argue, as she didn't want to anger the perpetrator. After changing, Mitzi folded all her clothes into the bag, and the kidnapper threw it into the nearest trash bin. After this, the man showed a gun and said that if Mitzi tried to escape, she would die. Then, the perpetrator took out a bottle with some kind of drink, poured Mitzi a glass, and forced her to drink it. The liquid was very bitter, but she had no choice and had to comply. It turned out to be strong alcohol. After some time, the little schoolgirl began feeling dizzy from what she had drunk, but the man forced her to drink another glass, after which she passed out. Apparently, the man did this so his captive would be disoriented and unable to escape. The stranger then headed down the road to an even more remote location. Here, there was an abandoned house, and it was completely deserted. The perpetrator took advantage of his victim for the first time. He tied Mitzi to the door, took lewd pictures, and raped the girl several times. The man left her there, tied up inside the car, and just left. Hours later, Mitzi woke up in total darkness. Her head was hurting from the strong alcohol that the perpetrator had forced her to drink. Mitzi didn't understand where she was, but realized the situation was very serious. Midsi Sanchez wondered for the first time if her relatives were searching for her, and if they even knew what was happening to her. Mitzi understood that the chances of finding her in this location were very small. Of course, her loved ones had no idea what had happened to her. By this point, everyone in the Sanchez house was beside themselves with terror. She had been missing for many hours already. No one could understand where Mitzi had gone. Her parents called all of her friends, but no one knew where she was. They were able to track Mitzi up to leaving school around 4 p.m., but there was no other information about her after that. No one had walked with her, seen where she went, or spoken with her. Her family called the parents of all of Mitzi's classmates, hoping she had gone to someone's house to play and lost track of time, but no one had any idea where she was. After this, the Sanchez family decided to contact the police and report Mitzi's disappearance. Law enforcement officers immediately gave great attention to this case, as it involved an 8-year-old child who couldn't have simply run away and could be in danger. But there was another reason why the police showed such active interest. In fact, during the same period, shortly before Mitzi's disappearance, 2 similar cases of little girls disappearing had occurred. Given that this was now the 3rd consecutive case, the police were convinced they were dealing with a serial kidnapper, rapist, or even killer. Naturally, they didn't want to immediately frighten the families. The previous cases hadn't received wide publicity. Nevertheless, people in this area already knew well what was happening. Many succumbed to panic, which only intensified when rumors reached the Sanchez family. All the children had disappeared near each other in the same district. One of the girls lived just 2 blocks from Mitt's house. The first victim, 7-year-old Amber Schwartz, disappeared in the same way near her house under unknown circumstances. Amber was kidnapped in broad daylight while playing in her parents' yard, literally right under their noses. No one knew what had happened to her, and the searches yielded no results. The next victim was 7-year-old Xiana Fairchild. She literally vanished into thin air. There were no witnesses, and no one saw what happened when she disappeared near her house. The police were racking their brains, understanding that the perpetrator must be using a car to carry out such quick kidnappings and escape unnoticed. Unfortunately, they couldn't even approximately track him. When the investigation into Mitt's disappearance began, it seemed they were dealing with one serial criminal, and his list of crimes could be much more extensive. Xiana and Amber had disappeared with a small interval between them, the last one having disappeared 8 months before these events. Given the time that had passed, They no longer hoped to find the children alive. Only the families of the missing didn't give up. All victims lived in Vallejo. It would have been impossible to constantly contain public anxiety, so the police needed concrete facts. Of course, first and foremost, it was necessary to stop the string of crimes and understand what was happening to the victims. Unfortunately, Midsi Sanchez's case resembled the previous ones, including their worst aspects, such as the complete absence of leads. The only things the police knew were the direction in which she had left the educational institution and the time. Unfortunately, this was a sparsely populated street in the city, and during working hours, a child could indeed pass unnoticed all the way to their house. Detectives examined everything and spoke with any potential witnesses who lived along the street, but no one could provide any useful information. Given the geography of the crimes, the police believed that the kidnapper must also live in Vallejo. This explained why he could remain unnoticed. The serial criminal likely knew these streets well and had precise orientation in time and space, which is why he could leave unnoticed. Moreover, his presence on these streets wasn't unusual for those around, so he might not attract attention at all. During this period, Mitzi's relatives were already actively searching for her throughout the city. Several volunteer groups had been formed, including numerous people concerned about the kidnapping. All of them were distributing and posting flyers with photographs and family contact information, and they were acting in the first hours after this work began. The owner of a nearby dump contacted the police station, reporting that he had found a blanket completely soaked in blood. Unfortunately, it was impossible to identify whose traces they were, but the DNA on the blanket didn't match Mitzi's. In the following days, the perpetrator moved around the city with his young victim, even beyond its limits. The man would stop in different places and do whatever he pleased. Several times he parked right in the city center, and it was later discovered that even patrol cars were near the stranger, not suspecting who he was. Mitzi was in the car the whole time, but was so terrified of the kidnapper that she was afraid to signal and ask for help. Mitzi was horrified, literally paralyzed, and didn't resist. He was almost always inside, so Mitzi simply couldn't reach out to people even if she had the strength to do so. At some point, it seemed she had resigned herself to her fate and was just waiting to see what would happen next. During this time, the perpetrator was driving around the bay, constantly moving and changing places where he would stop the car. This allowed him to avoid drawing attention and arousing suspicion. Under favorable circumstances, one could hide this way under the police's nose for quite a long time. The longest stops he made during these days were overnight stays outside the city. For this, he used secluded places. Additionally, the perpetrator would get out of the car to eat while never offering even a sip of water to his captive, though he kept giving her alcohol. Mitzi was visibly weakening from hunger and dehydration. It seemed as if the kidnapper was deliberately starving and dehydrating Mitzi, enjoying her slow and painful death. Mitzi hadn't eaten or drunk water for 2 days while being held against her will. During one stop, Mitzi gathered the courage and asked where the kidnapper was going. He told her he was going to watch the news and wanted to see Mitzi's mother crying in another report about her daughter's disappearance. It was painful for Mitzi to hear this. At this moment, the man once again stopped with his captive in the city, actually got out of the car, and approached the nearest cafe where there was a television. The stranger asked them to turn on the news channel, and as he expected, relatives of the Sanchez family were speaking at that moment. Mitzi's mother was in tears, appealing to people to help with the search and provide any information that would help save her child. The kidnapper was enjoying the mother's tears of desperation. When the perpetrator returned to the car, he showed Mitzi a flyer with her picture. He boasted that he had taken it, specifically telling the volunteer who was distributing flyers that he was going to take an active part in the search operation. He was deliberately mocking everyone and deriving pleasure from it. On the morning of the second day after the kidnapping, he made another long stop. This time, the stranger left the car under the scorching sun for many hours. It was August in California, so the inside of the car felt more like a heated furnace. Exhausted and dehydrated, Mitzi was suffering from thirst and heat. The perpetrator had left an extra large gap in the window, and she could see through it. The victim watched people passing by but was too afraid of the kidnapper to even try calling for help, instead crying from helplessness. It's hard to imagine how exhausted Mitzi was by the end of this hot day without water. Mitzi remembered a conversation with her uncle where he told her, "If you don't ask for forgiveness, you'll go to hell." Mitzi thought she was finished and decided to pray. She asked forgiveness from all members of her family. By evening, the perpetrator finally returned and headed to the industrial district located near the city. This was another deserted place that the kidnapper visited with his captive. He parked there and got out, heading to a secluded store for purchases. Mitzi still remained in the car, paralyzed with terror. But at this moment, she realized one important thing. The perpetrator had left a set of keys on the seat. Among them, one particularly caught her attention as it was smaller than the others. Mitzi realized this key might unlock the lock to which she was chained. Suddenly, the terror that had paralyzed her for 2 days was replaced by a desperate desire to save herself. Mitzi grabbed the set of keys and instinctively tried the small key in her lock. It worked. She freed herself and immediately climbed over the seat. The doors were locked, but she managed to open the window slightly and began squeezing through the gap. Just as she got outside, the kidnapper came around the corner with his purchases. He saw that the situation had gotten out of control and shouted for her to get back in the car. But there was no going back for Mitzi. Instead of returning to the car, she ran down the road as fast as she could. The perpetrator followed right on her heels. Naturally, an adult man was easily catching up to the weakened child. The street was deserted. It seemed there was no chance to escape. Unexpectedly, a pickup truck began turning onto the road. Fortunately, it turned toward Mitzi and immediately became alert. Mitzi ran right in front of the vehicle, nearly ending up under its wheels. When it stopped, Mitzi, with all the speed and agility she could muster, climbed up and made her way through the window, finding herself inside with the driver. All of this was happening in a deserted industrial district. Running away from the man, Mitzi was ready to hide anywhere, even climbing into another stranger's car. This said a lot. Mitzi introduced herself by name and explained that she had been kidnapped. The driver immediately decided to act and protect her. The perpetrator, who had almost caught up with his victim, looked in horror at the rescuer, then ran to his car, got behind the wheel, and tried to escape. However, he didn't do it quickly enough. The motorist managed to write down the car's license plate number and got a good look at the kidnapper's face. The young man saw that the child was very exhausted, gave Mitzi water, and immediately contacted the police. This call was a real miracle, as, by this point, the authorities still didn't have a single lead. They had no idea where to look for the 8-year-old girl. Mitzi had every chance of becoming another unsolved crime. Now, with a clear description of the perpetrator, the vehicle, and the license plate number, the police took only a few hours to apprehend him. Mitzi was finally returned to her family. The kidnapper turned out to be 43-year-old Curtis Dean Anderson. When they showed his photograph to Mitzi, she identified her tormentor and cried. Mitzi asked several times if he had been arrested by the police, to be sure that she was safe and nothing threatened her anymore. Mitzi's miraculous rescue and story became a sensation. Not only were her shocked parents and relatives at the house to welcome her, but also dozens of concerned citizens, including those who had actively participated in the search and rescue operation as volunteers. The house was full of journalists rushing to publish the story. Meanwhile, Curtis Anderson was already in the interrogation room. He wasn't a new face to the police, as he had previously been caught multiple times. However, each time, these were much less serious violations of the law than kidnapping and assault of an 8-year-old child. Before the kidnapping, Curtis had been involved in thefts and robberies. At least, that's all that was known about his other activities. Because of this, the man was familiar to the police and had served his first sentences, though they were short. He was lucky. After his first crime, Curtis even got away with just probation. Then there were several brief incarcerations, but due to good behavior, the criminal managed to get out early. That they managed to stop the kidnapper was a real miracle. Now, the police wanted to find out if he could be connected to the kidnappings of other girls, including Shaw and Amber. It wasn't excluded that he could be responsible for dozens of disappearances of other children in neighboring cities and even states. At first, the detainee was reluctant to cooperate with the investigation. But gradually, the man made a confession regarding Mitzi's kidnapping. They managed to break him within 2 days. Curtis confessed that he had indeed kidnapped Shaw, and even showed the police on a map where her body was buried. The criminal also confessed to kidnapping Amber, but couldn't show the exact location of her body on the map. According to the details, Curtis had killed 13 children. It was never possible to reliably establish who all these victims were, as he didn't name them or reveal the locations of their remains. It looked very much like the criminal was just teasing the police and enjoying the confusion he was creating in the process. Curtis didn't provide any details about the other crimes. To this day, it's unclear whether this was the truth or the product of a disturbed mind. In January 2001, Shaw's remains were indeed found in the Santa Cruz Mountains. She had been assaulted, was severely emaciated, and presumably died from an overdose of illegal substances that Curtis had been injecting her with while experimenting on her. The perpetrator had recorded the torture and assault of the girl on video. She likely died and was buried before Curtis kidnapped Mitzi. It turned out that the murderer would kill one victim and immediately start looking for a new one. If it hadn't been for the heroic act of Mitzi, who managed to escape, he could still have been continuing his bloody march across the states, and the number of victims would have increased. Amber's body was never found. During the trial, Mitzi was in the courtroom, just a few meters away from her tormentor. She gave a detailed account of the events that had happened to her during more than 2 days of horror. It's hard to imagine how difficult all this was for an 8-year-old child. Her loved ones were filled with pride for Mitzi, not suspecting that her struggle was just beginning. At the hearings, she was with her teddy bear, which helped her cope with her fears. The little one answered all questions with a firm and confident voice, detailing her horrifying story. Curtis couldn't be found guilty of murdering Shaw and Amber based solely on his confession, so an investigation was conducted. Witnesses were found who had seen Curtis talking to Shaw at a gas station in Vallejo on the morning of December 9th, 1999, when she disappeared. Others stated they had seen Curtis talking to her on the street several days before the kidnapping. They couldn't hold Curtis accountable for Amber's murder due to the absence of a body and any evidence. Nevertheless, the jury found Curtis Anderson guilty of kidnapping Mitzi and murdering Shaw, and he was sentenced to death. Curtis died of kidney failure on death row in 2009. Unfortunately for the victim of this tragedy, who had miraculously escaped a torturous death, the problems were only beginning. After the trial, Mitzi became a victim of bullying at school. It all started as simple curiosity, with everyone who felt like it approaching and asking Mitzi about the traumatic experience she had endured. Naturally, talking about this to everyone was not easy, but it was impossible to avoid the pressure. It got worse. Several months after giving birth, Mitzi heard that an 8-year-old Latina girl from a large family had disappeared in a neighboring city. The kidnapping victim was very similar to her. For Mitzi, this was a big shock, and she couldn't stay on the sidelines. Mitzi took a flyer, printed 3,000 copies, and distributed them. Then Mitzi contacted the family and helped them cope. She even became a volunteer at a foundation organized by the father of a missing 12-year-old girl named Polly Klaas. Mitzi began active work in this direction, sincerely believing that she was helping victims and their loved ones and making the world a better place. Gradually, Mitzi created her own social program, with which she visits various educational institutions. Her main goal was to teach children to recognize potential danger and identify people who might pose a threat on the street. She conducted all this in the format of presentations, with which she made hundreds of visits to teach children how to properly react to strangers. After several years of volunteer work, Mitzi created her own foundation to help kidnapping victims. Mitzi became someone who managed to cheat debt twice. Now, she realizes what a valuable gift fate gave her. Having overcome her weaknesses and trauma, Mitzi decided to use her story to make the world better, and she made her first step at age 8, thanks to which Curtis Anderson ended up behind bars.